Of all the ruins scattered across Europe, few command as much awe as the remnants of ancient Rome, the Colosseum, the Palatine Hill, the golden domes of long-fallen empires, each one a symbol of might, ambition, and grandeur. And yet, for every triumph etched in marble, there's a shadow that never made it into the textbooks, a silence deeper than the catacombs beneath the city, where no statue was ever carved, no name ever recorded. This is the silence of the boys who were bought not for labor, not for war, but for pleasure. In the heart of the Roman Empire, behind velvet drapes and gilded columns, existed a trade so lucrative and secretive that it flourished for centuries, feeding the insatiable appetites of senators, generals, and emperors. These were not relationships. They were contracts signed in flesh. The concubines, young, foreign, vulnerable, became property as soon as their feet touched Roman soil. Their value was measured not in strength or intellect, but in symmetry of bone, clarity of skin, and the softness of their voices. They came from conquered lands, the blonde tribes of the Rhine, the olive-skinned islands of the Aegean, and the burned red deserts beyond Syria. Some were prisoners of war, others were sold by desperate families, who saw no way to survive another winter. Once purchased, they were renamed, repurposed, and retrained, forced to walk, talk, and even breathe in ways that pleased their masters. Any trace of their past was wiped clean, not with fire, but with obedience. Their daily existence was a performance. They learned to smile through hunger, to entertain while aching, to remain silent when touched. Lavish robes covered bruises, gold necklaces disguised the chains they once wore. Some lived in marble villas, adorned in silk and trained in poetry. But the luxury only masked the truth. They were still prisoners. A single misstep, a frown at the wrong time, and the same hands that once fed them could just as easily cast them aside, or worse. Rome celebrated control, power, and conquest, but in its pursuit of glory, it built a system that devoured innocence. These boys, nameless in the official records, faceless in the mosaics, were collateral damage in a society that worshipped dominance above all else. Their suffering was not an anomaly, it was a design. And centuries later, their story is still struggling to be heard. The slave markets of ancient Rome did not smell of war or dust or sweat. They smelled of perfume and polished marble because the merchandise for sale was human flesh, often young, often beautiful, always terrified. Alongside the bustling forums where traders haggled over spices and textiles, behind curtained pavilions and bronze-plated doors, buyers with togas lined in purple came not to find laborers, but something far more intimate. They weren't seeking soldiers or scribes. They were hunting for boys carefully selected, appraised like livestock, and purchased for the private entertainment of Rome's elite. Some of these boys came from the eastern provinces, lean, dark-eyed, with a stillness about them, shaped by silence. Others were from the northern frontiers, tall and golden-haired, their features sharpened by colder climates. The origin mattered only insofar as it fed the buyer's fantasies. A Thracian for his fire, a Gaul for his innocence, a Greek for his perceived refinement. Once captured whether through war, kidnapping, or debt, they were marched hundreds of miles to reach the markets of the capital, often shackled, always afraid. Their arrival wasn't marked by mourning, it was an event. Wealthy Romans didn't walk through the markets like common citizens. They sent brokers' men trained to evaluate youth as if evaluating the cut of marble or the curve of a statue. Skin was inspected in full daylight, teeth examined for signs of age, limbs bent and prodded for symmetry. Any resistance was interpreted as weakness, any compliance as desirable. Age was a critical factor. Younger boys fetched the highest prices, not because they were less corrupted, but because they were easier to mold. Rome didn't just buy bodies, it bought futures to shape. The moment of sale was cold and transactional. Names were stripped, contracts were signed, prices were exchanged in sesterces, but the weight wasn't in the coin. It was in the eyes of the boy, who stood naked before strangers and realized that no one would ever again ask him what he wanted. Those taken into elite households were told they were the lucky ones. No mines, no farms, no lashes, just obedience, just beauty, just silence. Some were trained in poetry, music, and the soft politics of flattery. They were taught how to walk, how to bow, how to never meet a master's eye unless invited. They were dressed in silk and placed at the feet of generals and philosophers, expected to laugh on cue, cry if needed, and offer comfort that could never be mistaken for affection. Every gesture became performance, every breath a calculation. Their existence depended not on truth, but on illusion. Not all were so fortunate. The majority were kept in dim rooms, out of sight, until summoned. They waited in silence, uncertain whether the door opening meant food, punishment, or command. There were no clocks in Rome to count the hours of waiting, only the sound of footsteps approaching and the cold sweat that followed. For many, the only measure of time was how long their usefulness would last, and that window was brutally short. In this economy of desire, consent was never part of the equation. The very concept was foreign to Roman law when it came to slaves. No matter how lavish the surroundings, how ornate the garments, how refined the table settings, these boys were still considered property. Their bodies were not theirs. Their futures were not theirs. They had no legal name, no family to petition for their return, no recourse when pain came quietly in the night. Yet, the system thrived, not because the men of Rome were monsters, but because the society around them was built to normalize the arrangement. Philosophers justified it, poets romanticized it, artists immortalized it, and the boys themselves. They learned to disappear, to mask suffering behind soft eyes and practice smiles, to become desirable by being hollow. This wasn't just cruelty, it was policy, and the machinery of it was so efficient, so accepted, that no rebellion could touch it, not even the kind that burns silently in a young heart when he realizes no one is coming to save him. Once the transaction was completed, the boy ceased to be an individual. He was not adopted, not welcomed, not even introduced. He was absorbed into the rhythm of a household built not for him, but on him. From that moment forward, every waking hour served the purpose of someone else's desire. In the villas of Rome's elite, where marble floors cooled bare feet and bronze mirrors reflected every detail too clearly, these boys lived as ornaments and instruments. Their beauty was currency, their obedience a performance. They woke before dawn, long before their masters stirred, to prepare their appearance. Skin had to be smooth, free of blemishes, hair styled according to their owner's preference. There was no room for personal taste, only the image assigned to them, sometimes delicate, sometimes fierce, depending on the whims of power. Everything was choreographed. Their diet was meticulously controlled: lean meats, fresh fruits, and herbal tonics meant to maintain a certain shape. Any sign of weight fluctuation or aging was scrutinized. In some households, physicians were paid not to heal them, but to preserve them. The most valuable concubines were subjected to regimens more exacting than any athlete or performer. Hours of stretching to perfect posture, cold baths to tighten skin, oils and ointments to soften calluses that should never have existed, because their hands were never meant to labor. Even surgical procedures, rudimentary and agonizing, were inflicted to reshape their appearance. A crooked nose, a wide jaw, a misaligned tooth could mean the difference between status and rejection. No anesthetic, no consent, just an order and a scream swallowed by stone walls. Despite all this, the expectation remained: they had to smile, not with joy, but with practiced grace. The smile was armor, shield, and service. It was how they survived banquets, ceremonies, and private audiences, events where they were displayed like sculptures, but expected to behave like companions. They listened more than they spoke, and when they did speak, it was to flatter or amuse. Their voices were tuned to soothe. Their silence was tuned to obey. But not every day brought attention, and sometimes attention was worse than absence. Masters grew bored. Curiosity turned to cruelty. Games were invented, some psychological, others unspeakably physical. A favorite might be praised at midday and flogged by nightfall for no reason but caprice. Gifts were given, then torn away. Affection dangled like bait, then withdrawn to reinforce control. These tactics weren't accidental. They were a form of conditioning. The boy learned quickly that stability was a myth, kindness a transaction, safety an illusion. Isolation was another tool. In large estates with multiple concubines, interaction between them was discouraged, sometimes forbidden. Any attempt to bond, to form kinship, was treated as rebellion. They were competitors, not comrades. Jealousy was stoked deliberately. Rewards for beauty, punishment for age. Stories were planted to turn them against one another, divide, manipulate, dominate, and it worked. Many boys grew up without a single friend, trapped in a house full of others just like them, each pretending to be irreplaceable, each knowing they weren't. Even their leisure time, if such a thing existed, was structured. They rehearsed music, practiced posture, memorized lines of poetry to recite on command. They read philosophical texts not to understand them, but to quote them at the right moment to impress a guest. Everything was performative, curated, watched. Nothing was truly their own, not even the thoughts in their heads, which they learned to censor before speaking. A wrong word could lead to days of punishment. Silence, at least, was safe. In the rarest of cases, a concubine was elevated, granted certain privileges, an appearance of influence. He might dine closer to the master, speak in private, even be referenced in letters. But this elevation was not protection. It was proximity to danger. The higher he rose, the harder the fall. Many of these favored boys disappeared overnight, sent away, sold, disfigured, erased. No explanation needed, no one asked. Through it all, Rome watched. It didn't blink. The system wasn't a secret, it was a spectacle. Guests noticed the boy with sea-green eyes or the one who recited Sappho with a perfect accent. They complimented, sometimes even applauded, never questioning what it took to produce such perfection. That was the empire's genius, not just to conquer lands, but to normalize the unnatural. The boy was never invisible. He was seen constantly. He just wasn't seen as human. In Rome, control extended beyond the physical. The empire's power wasn't merely about force. It was about shaping thought, rewriting identity, and destroying will. For the boys kept as concubines, the body was only the first battleground. The real conquest happened in the mind. Owners didn't just want submission. They wanted emotional dependence, a form of loyalty born not from love, but from engineered confusion. Their methods were deliberate. Praise was inconsistent. Punishment was unpredictable. One moment, the boy was bathed in attention. The next, left to shiver in silence, ignored like an empty cup. It created a cycle of longing and addiction to approval that rendered resistance unthinkable. That wasn't weakness. It was conditioning. The master became the only fixed point in a world where nothing else made sense. Every glance, every gesture, every word from the owner carried meaning, like signs from a god. And the boy, starved for stability, clung to those signs, interpreting them obsessively. He began to shape himself around them. He anticipated needs before they were spoken. He smiled not to please, but to avoid being forgotten. In time, the boy often stopped seeing himself as separate. His own thoughts became irrelevant. What mattered was how he was seen and who he had to be to stay safe. To maintain this state, isolation was essential. Letters from home were never delivered. Any memory of family was treated as a distraction or a threat. Even when a boy had siblings in the same city, they were kept apart. The empire understood what proximity could ignite hope, and hope was dangerous. So silence became his inheritance. Even the household servants were trained to keep him separate. He ate alone. He trained alone. If he was allowed to speak to others, it was under supervision. Any act of connection had to be brief, non-committal, and ultimately meaningless. Inside the master's home, hierarchy was brutally clear. Those who pleased were elevated. Those who faltered were punished, often publicly, to reinforce the order. It wasn't just physical correction, it was humiliation. A boy caught crying might be paraded before guests as a lesson. Another, deemed too proud, might be forced to serve those ranked below him, stripping away even the illusion of dignity. The goal wasn't discipline, it was submission without end. And it worked, because every form of rebellion was used against them. If a boy grew distant, he was labeled cold. If he cried, he was ungrateful. If he spoke up, he was dangerous. This emotional chokehold was mirrored in rituals of reward. A boy might be given a token of affection, a ring, a silk scarf, even a whispered compliment, but none of it was lasting. The same ring could be taken and gifted to someone else the next day. The scarf could be burned as punishment for an imagined offense. The compliment never repeated. These objects weren't gifts. They were tests. And they trained the boy to be grateful for things already stolen from him. Affection, safety, belonging. He learned to see scraps as blessings. Because in that world, they were. As he grew older, the stakes changed. Beauty faded, youth slipped away, but the power structures remained. Some tried to adapt, offering wisdom instead of charm, but the rules never changed. Fresh faces replaced them, their usefulness diminished. And the master's men who once whispered affection, who once claimed attachment, became cold, transactional, indifferent. The boy, now nearly a man, would be reminded in small, sharp ways that he was no longer needed. Perhaps a locked door where it was once open, perhaps a meal served later, colder, without eye contact. These were not accidents, they were signals. Desperation crept in slowly. Some begged to stay, others tried to reinvent themselves. But the system didn't make space for permanence. It required turnover, spectacle, newness, and so many were discarded, traded like furniture, or passed along as favors to allies with less discerning tastes. A few were returned to the slave market, though at a fraction of the price. Some vanished. Rome did not record what happened to them. The city that carved its victories into stone did not etch a single name for those who lived and died in service of its appetites. What remains are fragments: a scratched name on a villa wall, a letter never sent, a broken instrument too small for adult hands. These pieces are not enough to tell every story, but they are enough to understand the pattern. The boy was not broken by violence alone. He was dismantled, piece by piece, by a society that knew exactly what it was doing and did it anyway. Freedom was never promised to them. It wasn't even a fantasy. For the boys taken into Roman households as concubines, there was no legal pathway to autonomy. Their identity was tied to the master's will, and Roman law ensured it remained that way. A concubine could not sue, he could not appeal. If he were beaten, silenced, or discarded, no court would intervene. The system was airtight by design. His body belonged to his owner, and so did everything he might feel: his pain, his thoughts, even his memories, if they threatened to stir rebellion. The law recognized the rights of property, and these boys were classified as such, no more protected than a horse or a piece of furniture. Even in death, they were disposable. There were no funerals unless arranged by the master, no graves marked with names unless it served the vanity of the household. If one died from illness, exhaustion, or despair, the estate might note the loss in ledgers, like broken glassware, but nothing more. The absence of justice was not an oversight. It was structural. It made cruelty efficient, scalable, sustainable. This lack of protection had immediate consequences. When the master wanted more than silence, when he wanted absolute control, there were no limits. Some imposed celibacy on their concubines outside of designated times. Others inflicted elaborate punishments for imagined slights, hunger, isolation, binding. There were stories whispered by household staff of boys locked away for days, denied light, stripped of language, fed only enough to keep them alive. The worst crimes happened quietly, with no one to record them, because there was no audience, and no one to care. Surveillance extended to the soul. Any attempt at faith, any whisper of religion outside what was sanctioned by the master, was treated as rebellion. Publicly, Rome celebrated many gods. But inside private homes, belief was something controlled. A boy caught praying could be punished for insolence. Some found solace in secret rituals, whispered hymns in forgotten languages. Others clung to objects, tiny talismans hidden in garments or beneath floorboards. But even those were dangerous. If found, they were confiscated, destroyed, and used as cause for further humiliation. Cultural erasure was part of the process. Boys from Judea, Gaul, Nubia, or Asia Minor had their tongues reshaped to speak Latin. Their birth names, often sacred to them, were erased. Some were renamed after flowers or birds or planet symbols meant to flatter the ego of their owners. Any attempt to preserve their heritage was punished as disobedience. Over time, many forgot the songs of their homeland. They forgot the scents, the faces, the words that once grounded them. Their past was not just buried, it was overwritten. Rome allowed this to continue because it served its myth, the idea that civilization required hierarchy, and that submission, beautiful, docile submission, was a form of harmony. Intellectuals wrote treatises on the natural order of things. Playwrights dramatized the suffering of slaves, always with an audience that laughed or wept, but never acted. The concubine became a symbol in their culture, not of tragedy, but of elegance under pressure. Even in pain, he was expected to remain graceful. Even in degradation, he was expected to elevate the room. Some boys were brought into elite salons, exposed to poetry, philosophy, and politics, but never as equals. They were decoration. Their fluency in culture was praised as novelty, not humanity. Their thoughts were indulged, but never taken seriously. And when they aged out of desirability, their fluency, their beauty, and their silence all ceased to matter. The men who had once dressed them in gold and quoted their wit forgot them in days. They were returned to the shadows without ceremony. Attempts at escape were rare, but they did happen. A few slipped into the crowds during public festivals, disguising themselves in common clothes. Others tried to reach sympathetic households, but the city was a maze of betrayal. Informants could be paid with a single coin. Slave catchers roamed the streets, and punishment for fleeing was always public. The boy was displayed, branded, often mutilated. His suffering served as a warning, not only to other concubines, but to the entire class of the enslaved. Resistance was not just discouraged, it was weaponized against the community. Some boys chose death, quietly, if they could. A blade stolen from a kitchen, a jump from the rooftop when no one was watching. Others starved themselves slowly, refusing to eat until the body surrendered. These acts weren't dramatic. They were quiet protests in a world that permitted no other form of dissent, and even then, their choices were taken from them. Households installed guards, imposed feeding schedules, even dosed boys with stimulants or sedatives to keep them docile. Death, too, was an act of disobedience. Rome measured greatness by conquest. It erected monuments to emperors and generals, to battles won and lands claimed, but no monument exists for the boy who was bought, trained, and silenced. His suffering wasn't recorded because it didn't serve the narrative. His humanity was inconvenient. His pain was not political. It was private and therefore invisible. But behind the walls of the most glorious empire the world had ever known, it was always there, echoing like a prayer no one was allowed to speak. When the luster faded, so did the illusion of worth. Rome had no use for a concubine who could no longer embody perfection. Time was the enemy, not for the masters, but for those whose bodies had once been their value. Aging brought no reverence. It brought silence, distance, and then dismissal, a wrinkle, a sag in posture, the dulling of eyes that once caught every gaze. These changes weren't seen as natural, but as failures. The boys who had once been pampered, envied, even paraded, were slowly removed from view, not with cruelty at first, but with indifference so absolute it bruised deeper than any lash. There were no farewell ceremonies, no acknowledgement of service or sorrow. One day, they simply weren't summoned. Rooms they once lived in were given to others, their belongings discarded or reused. Some were sold again, to lesser households or provincial estates far from the capital. There, the conditions were harsher, the masters coarser, and the anonymity complete. Others were reassigned to domestic labor, expected to clean and cook beside slaves they once outranked, now stripped of every ornament that once set them apart. The fall was not sudden. It was a slow erasure, and everyone in the system understood how it worked. A few managed to survive by reinventing themselves. They offered stories, knowledge, gossip, anything to remain useful. Some posed as tutors or translators, clinging to roles that kept them near power, even if no longer central to it. But the new generation of boys, younger and more pliable, always arrived, and with them came the brutal reminder that youth wasn't just an advantage, it was a currency with an expiration date. Once expired, there was no value left to trade. For those fortunate enough to be manumitted, freedom came with its own chains. The law allowed a master to grant liberty to a slave, often with restrictions. These men, once concubines, were rarely integrated into society. They bore the stigma of their past. They were recognized not as citizens, but as former possessions. Whispers followed them, doors closed without explanation. Even in the bustling markets or quiet temples, they were seen as ghosts of something shameful, something Rome enjoyed but never acknowledged. Mental scars outlasted the physical. Many couldn't form attachments. They distrusted kindness. Having learned it was usually a prelude to cruelty. Some lived alone, working menial jobs in the shadows of the empire's monuments. Others drifted into religious sects, searching for meaning in doctrines that promised peace or rebirth. But even there, they struggled. They had been trained to please, not to believe. They had been shaped to perform, not to exist freely. And when no audience remained, they often didn't know who they were anymore. The few who dared to speak of their past were met with discomfort or disbelief. Rome celebrated its warriors, thinkers, and builders, but not its victims. There was no room in its triumphal narratives for stories of quiet exploitation. No poet sang of the discarded concubine. No historian etched his name into the annals of glory. His truth was inconvenient, incompatible with the grandeur Rome demanded of its own reflection. But even unspoken, he endured. In the margins of forgotten scrolls, in half-burned letters never sent, in worn sandals found near abandoned estates, his story lingered, and it told of a system so thorough in its dehumanization that it turned even aging into punishment. A society that did not just use beauty, but punished its loss. That did not just silence dissent, but erase the possibility of grief. He was not destroyed by one act, but by thousands of small ones, every moment he was touched without permission. Every time he was ignored after giving everything. Every look that passed through him as if he were never there. And still, somewhere within, a part of him remembered what it was to be a son, a child, a person with a name whispered by someone who loved him. Rome's greatness came with a cost, not only to those it conquered, but to those it consumed from within. The empire didn't just build roads and aqueducts. It built silences, deep and enduring. And in those silences, countless voices were buried among them. The boys who were trained to serve and discarded when they could no longer shine. They didn't vanish. They were hidden. And some part of them is still waiting, centuries later, to be found. Rome's obsession with control didn't stop at individual bodies. It shaped entire systems, economic, religious, cultural, that supported the exploitation of concubines while shielding those responsible from scrutiny. The market for boys was not a hidden corner of society. It was a structured, profitable enterprise woven into the empire's machinery. Traders scouted regions recently conquered or destabilized. Young captives, especially those with pleasing features or exotic lineage, were prized above all else. They were taken, trained, and sold through a network that spanned from Britannia to Egypt. What Rome could not grow, it imported, and that included human ornamentation. The training school's quiet villas on the outskirts of cities or secluded courtyards within them operated with brutal precision. They were not schools in the traditional sense. They didn't educate, they erased. New captives arrived frightened, disoriented. Some still bore the bruises of capture. They were stripped of their languages, rituals, names. In their place, new behaviors were imposed: posture, inflection, silence. They were taught how to entertain, how to endure, and most importantly, how to make themselves pleasing to people who would never care about their thoughts. Compliance was rewarded, hesitation was punished, pain was routine, familiarity was forbidden. These facilities functioned like assembly lines for subjugation. Every gesture, down to how they folded their hands or looked over a shoulder, was corrected, not for their benefit, but for the preferences of a clientele that expected perfection. The boys learned to disassociate from their own feelings, to turn fear into elegance, to absorb violation without blinking. By the time they were brought to market, their bodies no longer belonged to them, and neither did their mannerisms. They moved with precision because any misstep might cost them everything. The demand was relentless. Rome's elite craved novelty, and the slave economy adapted. Some households traded their concubines regularly, not out of necessity, but boredom. Others hoarded them, turning private spaces into miniature courts of obedience. This culture of consumption didn't exist in isolation. It was reflected in the empire's policies, its art, even its spiritual practices. Statues celebrated youthful male beauty, but only as an aesthetic. Paintings depicted erotic submission, often stylized to obscure the pain beneath. Religion provided no refuge. Official temples upheld the power of masters. Independent faiths, those that offered gentleness or justice, were often persecuted or forced underground. For concubines, faith had to be private. If practiced at all, it was done in secret, a carved symbol beneath a bed frame, a prayer mouthed in darkness. Some clung to older gods from their homeland. Others gravitated toward mystery cults that promised redemption or rebirth. These moments of spiritual defiance were fragile and often punished harshly. A master discovering a boy's hidden icon might order its destruction along with any hope the boy had of sanctuary. Worship was another form of disobedience. Rome, even in its metaphysics, demanded loyalty above belief. Over time, the concubines who aged out of desirability saw the system from a different angle. They saw how it fed itself not just on bodies, but on silence. They had watched new captives arrive, eyes wide, hearts shattered, and recognized in them the versions of themselves long buried. Some tried to protect the younger ones. A warning here, a word of comfort there. But kindness itself was dangerous. Masters discouraged solidarity. Any affection between concubines was interpreted as sedition. The system needed them isolated, ashamed, and grateful. In rare moments, acts of resistance occurred. A boy might spill wine on purpose during a banquet, knowing the backlash it would bring. Another might speak out, just once, in front of a guest too powerful to ignore him. These were not mistakes. They were decisions, small flames lit in a city built of stone and denial. But most of the time, the resistance was quiet. It lived in the way a boy remembered his original name, even if he never said it aloud. In the way he closed his eyes during a performance, not out of fear, but to imagine someplace else. These were acts not of escape, but survival. The empire didn't see these things. It couldn't. Its self-image required the illusion of consent, of order, of beauty unblemished by cost. So it turned the concubines into metaphors, stories, background details, and a larger narrative of conquest. But those boys weren't symbols. They were people. And even as the empire marched forward expanding borders, rewriting laws, raising monuments, it left behind countless bodies and lives, consumed and discarded in silence. Their presence may not have survived in records, but it remains in the foundation, in the dust, in the spaces between marble columns where no one dares to look too long. Long after the marble cracked and the banners fell, long after Rome became a memory whispered through ruins and dust, the empire's legacy endured not just in roads and architecture, but in silence, in the things it chose not to record, in the lives it consumed and discarded with clinical precision. The boys taken as concubines did not leave behind titles or descendants or memoirs, but they left something deeper, a quiet echo in the bones of history, a presence that lingers not through celebration, but through absence. Their suffering was not an accident. It was not a deviation from Rome's ideals. It was embedded in them. Power was worshipped not for what it built, but for what it could take. The empire defined its greatness through what it could own: land, gold, gods, and people, especially people. The concubines were not forgotten because their stories lacked drama. They were erased because they threatened the illusion that greatness can be clean, that beauty is harmless, that power is noble. But their silence was not perfect. It cracked in places, in forbidden prayers, in fractured mosaics, in the small, defiant decisions that no law could erase. Those moments remind us that even at the heart of the most powerful machine, there was always resistance, subtle, often invisible, but enduring. What does it mean to survive a system designed to unmake you? Not every concubine escaped. Not every one of them found peace. But some endured. Some carved fragments of self from the wreckage. And those fragments, scattered across time, speak more truth than any marble statue ever could. Their story forces us to confront not only what Rome was, but what civilization becomes when desire outruns conscience. When human beings are reduced to ornament, when silence becomes a kind of language and performance a form of survival. In telling this story, we are not just recovering the past, we are examining the structures that allowed it and asking what still remains. And maybe that's why the story survives. Not because it was preserved, but because it was buried too carefully to disappear. Not because they were remembered, but because someone, somewhere, couldn't forget.